Hey, what is up? This is Jake Hofer with Exodus. Just finished up a morning hunt here, but we're going back all the way to August when we stopped at John Eberhart's home and recorded a Whitetail Cribs episode, and then actually headed out to one of his stand locations where he's killed some Pope and Young bucks. And we recorded 2 episodes. The first one we've released. It's actually our most downloaded episode on Trail Cam Radio, and this one is all about scrapes and how he has had success in correlation to scrapes, how he hunts them throughout the season. So we figure this is a really good time of year to discuss scrapes, and who else than John Eberhart to talk about it. So we hope you guys enjoy it. Let's go ahead and get into the interview.
Lights,
camera,
follow the trail.
ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
Trail Cam Radio from the guys at Exodus.
All right, we're still on Eberhart's farm here, or where he hunts by permission. And last year when we did this August trip, every stop along the way, we had a little bonus interview, and it was all about Scrape Week, hunting scrapes, pre-rut, and you were on the list of people we want to talk to because I know you're a big advocate of hunting the pre-rut late October, and that's what this is all about, of getting people excited and realizing that this is one of your best opportunities to kill really solid mature bucks. So would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. Over half of the bucks that I've shot that are in the make the record book were shot at scrapes. It might have been at a destination fruit tree like an apple tree, or it might have been at a white oak or a red oak, but there was scrapes underneath the food trees. So I'm a huge scrape guy. But to me, if you're hunting scrapes, they have to meet a very specific criteria. They have to have excellent perimeter cover around the actual kill zone of the scrape area. They have to have adequate transition security cover to a known bedding area, because let's say you find a primary scrape area and you've got 200 yards of open timber, and then there's a bedding area on the other side of the timber. A mature buck in a state like a Michigan is not going to leave that bedding area and walk through that vulnerable 200 yards of open timber to access that primary scrape area. So even though the scrape area has good security cover around it, if it doesn't have good transition security cover to a known bedding area, the odds of a daytime visit by a mature buck are pretty close to 0. So all of the activity at a scrape area, no matter how active it is, how big they are, how deep they are in the ground, it's all irrelevant if the scrape area doesn't meet the criteria for a daytime visit by a buck that I want to kill. You may have 1.5 and 2.5-year-old bucks visiting that scrape area, but that's not what I'm after. For instance, let's say, like right up here at the top of this little ridge, there's a crop field. It's a big crop field. Now, if there's a scrape area on the edge of that crop field when I'm postseason scouting, in February, March, or April, if there's a scrape area, and there's a good tree next to it, there's a good chance I might set that tree up. Now, the only times I will hunt that scrape area is when the field is actually in standing corn, where they've got the excellent security cover, because a lot of times they'll bed in the standing corn, so they can take a couple steps out of the standing corn. They got that security cover right there for a quick exit and work a scrape. But if it's in an open, beans or hay or picked as soon as the corn is picked, I would never hunt that spot, because a mature buck is not going to visit that next to that big open vulnerable area during daylight hours. So scrape areas are phenomenal. They're also best hunted during pre-rut, like you're talking about, October 20th to 25th through November 5th, because at that time frame, the majority of the does are not in estrus. So they are actually, their testosterone's rising, and the mature bucks, they actually go out and start searching for those early estrus does. And when they're doing that, they're visiting their scrape areas. Scrape areas are 100% of the time always put where there's heavy doe activity. So that's why they're during the pre-rut, they're checking their scrape areas because they're also checking for doe activity, and they'll freshen the scrapes up. Because usually, if you've got matriarch does, and when they get close to coming into heat and into estrus, they will actually visit and loiter at those scrape areas, waiting for a buck to come in and pick them up. They prefer having the dominant buck pick them up, but if the dominant buck's doed up, the next one in line will pick it up. So scrape areas are awesome, but if they're not hunted correctly at the right time of season, the right time of day, and with the right type of security cover, they're a waste of time to hunt.
What are some of the right times of day, in your opinion, in terms of is it weather conditions, or is it time of day, location of the scrape, and approximation with the cover?
I will say weather conditions make a difference. It seems like after a rain, especially I guess morning or evening, it doesn't really matter. After a rain, they like to freshen their scrapes up, especially during pre-rut, when they're not physically with a hot doe. But I've found my best time for hunting scrapes has been in the evenings. I don't know why, because I was just talking about, my 4 book bucks I got that I shot in the first 2 days of season were all mornings. But I've definitely had my best scrape hunting activity and success in the evenings.
Well, as you said, in that time frame, in that time of year, you're not hunting scrapes like in the early season. So maybe that's why you're having more success in the evening.
Well, sometimes in the early season I will be hunting at a scrape, but I'm not hunting at the scrape because it's a scrape. I'm hunting at the scrape because it's at an apple tree or it's at a white oak, and they're dropping food and they just happen to have scrapes there. I found scrapes as early as I think August 23rd was the earliest I've ever seen scrapes. So what I will typically do is, of my 45 trees that I have prepped and ready to hunt going into the season, maybe 20 of them, let's just say 20 of them are early season locations because they're food locations, mast or fruit trees, or a scrape area that may be on the edge of a standing cornfield. What I'll do is I'll do a speed tour. And by a speed tour, I will dress in my scent lock and I will go through and check only my early season hunting locations. I don't mess with my rut phase locations at all. But I'll just check my early season mast and fruit locations or scrape areas that are on the edge of crop fields if it's in standing corn. And then by doing that, I always do it after September 20th, because by September 20th, most of the mature bucks have been rubbed out since at least September 5th. So they're going to be rubbed out at least 2 weeks. So if I find a scrape area or a mast tree or a fruit tree that's dropping, there's also going to be some form of buck activity there. Obviously, scrapes are buck activity. But, if I check 20 trees, I will hunt the best trees for the first 2 or 3 days of season based on the buck activity, how high the rubs are. The older bucks are, the higher the rubs are up on the trees, how active the scrapes are, does it have the right security cover there. It's going to have the right security cover there because that's the way I set them up.
Yep.
Unless it's next to a field where it has to be standing corn. So I have a rhyme and a reason to everything that I do. So even though I may have 20 early season locations, I may only hunt 3 of them. And they're going to be based on mass production, fruit production, and what kind of buck sign is at that location. And is it mature buck sign versus subordinate buck sign?
Makes sense.
And I'm not one of those guys that go out and look for deer. I never go look for deer because all my hunting spots are too far from my house. This is the closest one, and it's 40 minutes. The other ones are 2.5 hours.
How many does it take a day or two to do a speed scout on those?
It takes about 3 days, 3 different days. And I try to do it on days where it's raining or windy to mask my noise. Because a lot of times, like this spot right here, I've got a tree right there. And if I'm coming down in here to check that for scrapes and stuff, there may very well be a deer bedded right here.
Right.
Because there hasn't been any pressure here yet. So they're bedded more peripheral. There's no reason for them to be deep within the bedding area. Now on public lands, that's not going to be the case. Public lands, because there's so much preseason scouting, they're going to be deep in the bedding areas before season even starts. But on something like this, they may bed on the peripheral edges. So if it's raining or it's really windy, I can come in that path where we went down to that apple tree, and if there was a deer bedded right here, he would not know I was there. Because early season, it's going to have a lot of foliage on the ground. It's not going to see me, and it's not going to hear me because of the rain and the wind. Whereas if it was a dry day from here, it would definitely spook for me coming in up there.
Out of the dates from October 20th to the 25th, is there one that sticks out from 40 years experience?
Between what days?
October 20th to 25th, some of your favorite pre-rut days that you mentioned. Is there one day that has been an outlier out of some of the others? And the only reason I ask that is just from the trail camera data that we've seen. The 25th, 26th have been good. The 22nd, 23rd.
Halloween has been a really good day. 28th. So right around the 28th, 29th. I shot a really nice buck at a scrape across the road here. Was it 21 inches, that 10 point? And that was around October 20th. And he was chasing a doe into a standing cornfield. And I don't think she was in heat, but there was some scrapes right there. It was underneath a red oak. I don't think she was in heat because she went into the corn and he stopped on the edge. And I ended up having to lift. It happened so fast I had to lift. The only time in my saddle ever that I've had to lift my bow over my lead and contort my body and take that shot at like 6 yards. Anyway, I took that shot and I killed him. But if she would have been in heat, he would have pursued her into the corn. But she was not in heat, so he didn't. And also, I don't think he wanted to go in the corn because the corn rows were going this way. She went this way, so his rack was so wide for him to go into that corn without her being in heat. His antlers would have had to bust down a lot of corn, which would have tired him out pretty quick. I would assume. But that was an interesting. Usually, I start killing my deer October 25th and on. That's when I start getting serious.
Yeah. Okay. So as everyone listening to this probably has a scrape in mind, and they're thinking, okay, if this is the time I need to be hunting this, then how should I go about setting? What are some of the golden rules and correlation? We can use this example as for discussion here because we can all elaborate on it as well.
Well, I would say on scrapes.
Yes.
Okay.
Late October, hunting a setup on a scrape,
Okay.
a scrape that's going to be there every year. It's tight to cover.
Yep. Well, typically when I'm setting them up, it's not going to be October. It's going to be postseason.
Well, yeah.
If I have the option, I will almost always, if there's a tree available, because the wind is predominantly out of the northwest. If I have the option and there's a tree, let's say 15 to 20 yards on the south or southeast side of a scrape area, that's the tree I would set up in. And then I would also clear a shooting lane 20 to 25 yards beyond that. So basically I'm going to have a 20-yard shot to the scrapes and then a 20 to 25-yard shot beyond the scrapes in the opposite direction. Because it's very common for a mature buck, a big buck, to scent check a scrape area from downwind. So, and I've killed 2 big bucks in Michigan that did that. They did not come into the scrapes because the scrapes are always in an open area. Even though it's small, typically, they wouldn't want to come into that open area and be vulnerable. So one that I shot a few years ago, quite a few years ago, 2014, it was 154-inch 10-point. It was in Michigan, and I was in a tree, and I was about 15 yards on the downwind side of the tree because the wind was out of the northwest. I was on the southeast side, which is where I set it up for that purpose, and I had about a 20-yard shooting lane behind me. And I'm sitting there, and here comes this buck over this little hill, and I thought he was going to come right into the scrape. So I'm sitting here, and I'm in my saddle, and I'm ready. And he gets about 20 yards from the scrapes, and he turns, and he goes around. That's north. He turns, and he comes around, and he goes around to the east side of the scrapes, and he's circling around. Well, I've got a shooting lane over here to the east. So I hurry up, and I swing around. I step around my steps, pick up my bow, and I move around on my steps, and I get on the other side of the tree. And just as I'm getting 180 degrees on the other side of the tree, his butt is going through my shooting lane, so I can't take that shot. So now he's coming back around. So now I move back around the tree to the other side, and now he comes around, and he stops at about 20 yards, basically downwind of me, downwind of the scrapes. So he's about 40 yards downwind of the scrapes. And he's sniffing the air, and he's smelling for does. And a little bucket came in earlier, a little 8-point. And I don't know if he caught wind of that, but something caught his attention because then he turned, and he wasn't in my shooting lane, but he turned, and he's coming through the brush, and he stopped right directly below my tree, right where I climbed up the tree. And he stopped there. He's like that far from the tree. And he's looking out in the scrapes, and the scrapes are out there like 18, 20 yards, something like that. And I thought for a second he was going to go out into the scrapes because I won't take that straight down shot. And he does a lip curl and sniffs, and he's like, okay, nothing there of interest. So he turns around, and he walks in the exact same footprints that he came in on. So now he's walking directly away from me, and then I see him starting to curl back in the exact way he came in. So now I know he's going to go back into that bedding area, and he's going to go through that shooting lane again. So I spin back around at 180 degrees to the other side of the tree again in my saddle, and I'm ready now. So I come at full draw as soon as his nose breaks the shooting lane edge, and when he gets out there, I stopped him and I shot him. But that deer did not. He was not going to go into the actual scrapes physically to the scrapes and work a scrape in the middle of the day. And this was like 2 p.m. He checked it from downwind. So if I have the option, I will always prep something on the downwind side and then hunt it when the wind is. Not that I'm worried about getting winded, because I'm not worried about getting winded, but I set it up on the downwind side because that's a mature buck's routine.
So one thing that I picked up on from a previous conversation with you was that when you're hunting out of state, a lot of times you're running cameras on primary scrape areas, and also when you're going to hunt those times, it's usually later in the year. Like in Kansas this year, you're going November 16th.
Right. Thanksgiving is when it gets good.
So when usually everyone talks about scrapes, they're talking October 22nd to the 1st of November. When do you see those scrapes start to turn back on, and why do you think that is?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I've got a really good answer for you. Because pre-rut, there's a pre-rut, peak rut, post-rut. Okay, pre-rut is what we were just talking about. That's when the bucks are out checking their scrape areas for those early estrus stows. Once the peak rut gets there, most of your big bucks, even out there, even when we're in Kansas, I'm talking the 150s and bigger, they're doed up. You hardly ever see them. They push does into bedding areas, and they don't come out during the daytime. So you'll see 125, 30, maybe a 140 incher, but you're not seeing the big ones. So once it gets about the 23rd, 24th, it's almost to the day, 23rd, 24th of November, that's when you start seeing those big bucks, because now the majority of the does in the area are bred, and now he has to go out just like he did during pre-rut. He has to go out post-rut. His testosterone is still high. He has to go out and physically search now for those late estrus does. So they're not as frequent as they are during the peak rut. And during peak rut, once he finishes one cycle, he can just go take over the next one. Even if she's with another buck, the dominant one will take her over and push her into a bedding area breeder. So post-rut is every bit as good as the pre-rut. I think it's actually a little bit better because they're a little bit more worn down. Their eyes are drawn. They just come through with reckless abandon, like I was mentioning with that 180 incher we talked about. And I don't know. I think after the 23rd or 24th in the Midwest, post-rut, if you're hunting in a state where the gun season doesn't open until December, I think that post-rut is absolutely the best time to kill a big buck.
That's pretty interesting because I've killed 4 bucks with a bow, fairly new to archery hunting. 2 of them, November 23rd, November 24th.
Yep.
And in Pennsylvania, you can't hunt.
That is interesting.
In the state of Pennsylvania, there's no deer season after November 20th.
After when?
November 20th.
I thought you poached him
in
on
Ohio.
November 23rd?
I shot him in Ohio.
Oh, okay.
I shot those in Ohio.
I'm just kidding.
But I always said, that's one of the best times to be in the woods.
Yes.
In the state of Pennsylvania, you can't be in the woods.
Yep. It's that late rut. Most of the does are bred, and bucks are just a lot more active looking for those late estrus does. They have to move a lot more because there's a lot of bucks in those areas, and it's really competitive. So they have to get out and physically search, or the late does are going to get bred by somebody else.
Makes sense.
Yeah. That's interesting. You picked the same 2 days, 23rd and 24th.
Yep. There's some validity to that. Some truth for sure.
That's pretty cool.
Okay, well that's refreshing to know because people listening to this is probably going to air that 3rd week of October, so they're thinking, all right, I'm going to get it done this week, and then if it doesn't happen, don't quit. It's going to get better. That 23rd, 24th. In Illinois, I'll see that often, but our shotgun season is the weekend prior, so things change pretty drastically. But I still get some really big deer on camera during that time, and them going back to those community scrapes. So
gun seasons change things.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why Ohio, Iowa, and Kansas, where they open in really late in November or December, are so awesome for post-rut hunting.
That's great. Well, anything else, Cameron?
Those are my questions.
All right, perfect. Well, John, thank you for being part of Scrape Week.
Absolutely.
And
Thank
I'm sure
you.
you've already
Thanks
killed a big deer by now. So.
Thanks for the opportunity again.